Air Chief Davies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm going to speak to you as a professor, although I will join the pensioners in 2 weeks' time, and as a former UN official. Looking at the title, I have a sneaking suspicion that I've been invited to speak to you as a disruptive influence. As we've heard from just about all the speakers, world order is at an inflection point. Not the least because the post-1945 US constructed and policed liberal international order is under stress. And part of that is the global nuclear order. To link it to the address from the Admiral we just heard, we face only two existential threats in the world today. One is climate change, the other is the bomb, except the bomb can kill us a lot sooner and a lot faster. Now, what I find interesting is that those who reject the science of climate change are derided as denialists, except, of course, in Canberra, where they're known as the government. Those who reject the reality of nuclear threats are praised as realists. Now, that's only half facetious, and I want to take you through that. In terms of the broad theme of the conference, every historical era faces its own set of challenges. Where the prevailing geopolitical equations converge with and are in harmony with the prevailing normative architecture, you will have, by and large, stability. One of the reasons, particularly in the global nuclear orders, that we are experiencing stress is the divergence between the geopolitical equations on the one hand and the normative architecture on the other. Today, effectively, the global nuclear order is bifurcated between two global treaties. The NPT, the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Ban Treaty, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted at the United Nations last year by 122 countries. So today we have two global treaties for governing global nuclear order and setting nuclear policy directions. Now, I have to make sure I understand which ones. Wonderful. It works. I don't usually use PowerPoint. I want to make sure you understand that I speak to you as an Australian of Indian origin, not as an Indian living in Australia. That's important distinction in identity, because when the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, was being negotiated, I got it from both groups. To the Australians, I was Indian. You duplicitous, deceit-prone Indians, what do you think you're doing, being a naysayer to a global treaty again? And the Indians said, what the F do you Australians think you're doing with us? This is a matter of national security. Because what happened, of course, was the proposed treaty was blocked by India in the Conference on Disarmament, and Australia, with US encouragement and support, took it from there to the United Nations General Assembly and had it endorsed by the General Assembly. And then we all said to the Indians, this is now a global norm, and forget about the law of the treaties, forget about the fact that you were protesting against it, you are now bound by this norm. Well, guess what? We objected to the Ban Treaty being taken to the UN, didn't take part in the conference, but that global norm now has been articulated by the General Assembly. So it's just a useful reminder that we need to be careful of actions today, because the precedent might come back to bite us in a decade or 2 decades hence. That's a very quick pictorial representation of where we stand with nuclear weapons today. It will be familiar to you. The main point of showing this for me is to emphasize how more than 90% of the world's stockpile of just under 15,000 warheads, nuclear warheads, is actually held by Russia and the United States, 7,000 and 6,800 respectively. And if you add the other 3 nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT as such, that's China, Britain, and France, between them, they own 98% of the world's stockpile. That's important because as we'll go through it, you'll understand it depends upon whether you identify the weapons themselves as a problem or who has them as a problem. But it's worth remembering that. In terms of shifting from the NPT to the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty, let's call it the Ban Treaty. To go back to what I was saying about at a certain level of abstraction, it's the governance arrangements for meeting the existing challenges of the day that decides whether you have stability or whether you are disrupted. And remember my point about the distinction between the normative architecture and the geopolitical equations. The NPT reflects the geopolitical dominance of the 2 superpowers of the time, who embedded their normative preferences into the treaty and the resulting imbalance of obligations between non-proliferation and disarmament. Now, there are 2 problems today. The 5 nuclear weapon states are also the 5 permanent members, the P5. But the geopolitical reality in the outside world has gone in one direction, whereas the Security Council permanent membership is frozen in time in 1945. And that increases tremendously the transaction costs of enforcement of Security Council decisions, because it doesn't reflect the geopolitical balance of power anymore. But secondly, the normative balance of power is now being asserted by the majority in the General Assembly, not the major powers. And this widening disjuncture between the normative balance of power and the geopolitical balance of power is a major cause of disruption. And that's across the board, but not excluding nuclear weapons. So bear that in mind as an explanation, as a broad structural explanation. The NPT had 3-part bargain: facilitate the peaceful applications of nuclear energy, including a transfer of technology and financial assistance if required, but do that by instituting safeguards to guard against the risk of diversion of peaceful materials to military purposes, in particular the bomb. And this non-proliferation set of obligations was rigorous, it was immediate, it was legally binding, it was verifiable, and it was enforceable. None of these 5 adjectives applies to the disarmament obligation in Article 6 of the NPT, which I'll read out shortly. But the Article 6 obligation nonetheless is there. And that was the price, that we recognize that you can't do it immediately, but you who have the bomb, and we give you the right to maintain it, nonetheless promise to engage in good faith negotiations to bring it out. But over time, that imbalance was institutionalized by the 5 nuclear weapon states into permanent possession through the doctrine of deterrence. And they paid lip service to disarmament, but it was only lip service. We'll get around to it someday, sometime in the future. Meanwhile, the world is too insecure. Let's not talk about that, but let's make sure we don't make it even more insecure by curbing proliferation ambitions. And this meant effectively there was a double instrumentalization of the NPT by the nuclear weapon states. Firstly, they used it to legitimize their own indefinite possession of the nuclear weapons. So what was meant as a temporary legal permission to hang on to the bomb was transformed into the language of entitlements, legal rights, enduring legitimacy to keep it indefinitely. And the second instrumentalization of the NPT was, this is our principal management tool to enforce the non-proliferation obligations on everyone else. And since the 5 nuclear weapon states coincided with the P5, that's the enforcement mechanism that was used. So effectively, the requirements, the belief in and the requirements of nuclear deterrence trumped the language of disarmament and the calls for disarmament at repeated 5-yearly review conferences of the NPT and coming through the UN system. So national security takes precedence over international security. In the ban treaty, you get a reversal of that relationship between deterrence and disarmament. The majority of the world's countries have said, no, the disarmament now will take priority over deterrence. And international security will take precedence over national security, and humanitarian concerns will override national security concerns. What does it ban? Bans the possession, bans the testing, it bans stationing, which has implications for all NATO allies, it bans the use of nuclear weapons, and it bans the threat of use of nuclear weapons. For deterrence, of course, you need not just possession, but you need doctrines of use and threat of use. Otherwise, deterrence breaks down. You need to be able to threaten retaliation. For that, you need the infrastructure of possession and delivery capabilities and resiliency, to pick up a phrase from the last 2 presentations. And you need survivability. If the threat of use is prohibited, as it is in the ban treaty, it fatally undermines the doctrine of deterrence. It is simply not compatible. So these are the various elements that are banned. In terms of what the agenda will be, the next stage will be for the treaty to enter into force. It was open for signature in September. 50 countries signed on the same day. As of now, 57 countries have signed, 5 have ratified. It will enter into force 90 days after 50 countries have ratified. Given that 122 voted in favor, I think the general expectation is it will enter into force sooner rather than later. Meantime, we are into the 5-yearly NPT review cycle. The next review conference will be in 2020. That will mark 50 years, 50, since the NPT entered into force. And as part of that, we have preparatory committee meetings, the second one to be held next month, and we'll have a third next year, and we may or may not have a fourth, depends on whether we feel the need to. Meantime, there's also the UN high-level conference on disarmament that's going to be convened starting in May. So again, the 2 parallel tracks reflecting these 2 treaties, although the high-level conference is not exactly under the ban treaty, but it's similar states who voted for one have voted for the other. Why then this drive for the new ban treaty, which the nuclear weapon states insist is a threat to the NPT? Well, firstly, because of mounting and growing frustration at the failure to implement the Article 6 obligation to eliminate nuclear weapons. 50 years after the NPT was negotiated, most countries have simply stopped believing the promise of someday we'll get around to it. 50 years is a fairly long time. It's a fairly long rope, if you like. If you look at the agreed outcome document and action agenda from the last successful review conference, which was the 2010 one, the 2015 collapsed, we couldn't get an agreed outcome. This is a study that my center did, and it is actually the best study, even if I say so, in the world. If you switch to Arabic for a moment and go right to left, you'll see the peaceful users implementation record is very good. Nuclear non-proliferation, it's ambivalent. But when you come to disarmament, the non-fulfillment becomes much more important than fulfillment. And remember, only the possessor countries can implement disarmament side. So bear that in mind also. Now, of course, the NPT Review Conference, all the states parties take part. Therefore, it reflects the lowest common denominator agreement. And even that cannot be met on the disarmament side in particular. If you take a more exacting standard, which is a set of recommendations by the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, co-chaired by our own Gareth Evans and his counterpart Yoriko Kawaguchi, the former Japanese foreign minister, and measure progress against their recommendations, which were all made by people who had held high-level executive decision-making positions. So this was not ICANN, let's put it that way. It was not a bunch of activists. These were people who had had serious positions. It's much worse in terms of what is needed and what is actually being done. Meanwhile, of course, the 5 original countries that had the bomb, the number has expanded. We now have 9. So nuclear weapons have spread to other countries in more volatile, conflict-prone regions with much weaker command and control systems. And so while there are far fewer numbers of warheads today, the prospects of a nuclear war, if not by design then by accident, rogue launch, system malfunction, have actually grown. This is a different way of slicing that earlier diagram. And there's 2 or 3 points of interest in this one. Firstly, you notice how the numbers, global stockpiles, actually kept increasing even after the NPT has entered into force. It's difficult to see how that is held to be compliant with NPT Article 6. Second, the numbers have fallen quite dramatically. And the nuclear powers, in particular Russia and the United States, make the point that they may not have been acting under the NPT, but the 75 to 80% reduction in numbers since the Cold War peak is proof of good faith intentions to try and meet the obligations to get rid of weapons eventually and reduce numbers quite significantly. And the third feature in this again is how the other countries disappear. You cannot really see the lines because these 2 countries dominate. Meanwhile, arms control efforts stalled, going in reverse. As of the start of last year, forget about this year even. ABM treaty, of course, the Americans pulled out. We allege the Russians have been violating their INF commitments and obligations. No arms control agreements. Doesn't seem any prospect that New START will be extended beyond 2021, I think it is when it runs out. And of course, no agreements between other countries either. Nuclear risks, in the meantime, climbing. Upsurge in geopolitical tensions, volatility in Europe, volatility in the Middle East, problems between India and Pakistan. Last year also a tense military standoff between India and China. Korean Peninsula, well, it continues to be in the news. A general perception that risks were multiplying and intensifying. Meanwhile, a humanitarian movement sprang up, pointing out that the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. And so the general conclusion that in terms of advancing the agenda, as opposed to where we have got to, the NPT perhaps is no longer fit for purpose. Many real accomplishments, many real achievements. We don't want to undermine that, but if you want to move the agenda forward, non-proliferation has been universalized to every country other than those who actually have the bomb. Security issues were taken over by the Nuclear Security Summit. Peaceful users' interest has declined quite dramatically, particularly after the Fukushima accident. Disarmament, nothing is happening. So the normative capacity is exhausted rather than that it was never there. In other words, you have 2 things intersecting. A receding global nuclear arms control tide and elevated, or perceptions of elevated nuclear threat levels. And then along come Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, whom you can, I think, call the godfathers of the Ban Treaty in terms of their effect on people's perceptions of risks. This is a public opinion poll of just Americans. The figures would be significantly higher in terms of concern if you did a global public opinion survey. Incidentally, just out of curiosity, how many people in this audience are confident that President Trump would know what you were talking about if you use the words NPT? I don't see any hand coming up. Okay, remember that. The famous Doomsday Clock. Of course, if you take it literally, you can rubbish it very easily. They've ranged between, whatever it is, 17 minutes in 1991 at the end of the Cold War to 2 minutes, the closest it's been, that was 1953, and now again today. And clearly, for all these years, we haven't had a nuclear war. But that's less important than the fact that it's a metaphor. It is an eminent group of scientists and others who make the judgment. And the judgment is that we are in one of the most dangerous periods the world has experienced, as dangerous as it was at the start of the hydrogen bomb era in 1953. And that judgment is what is important, not the literal 2 minutes to midnight there. And that gives you, as I said, the changes in that clock. The other motivating factor behind the Ban Treaty is the belief in the symbiotic link between non-proliferation and disarmament. It's both a logical truth and an empirical truth. If nuclear weapons did not exist, they could not proliferate. Because they do exist, they will proliferate. In other words, the very existence of nuclear weapons is a sufficient guarantee of their proliferation. Conversely, nuclear disarmament is a necessary condition of nuclear non-proliferation. And so our choice boils down to, if we actually want non-proliferation, and if we want to protect and preserve the gains of that, then we have to prepare actively for disarmament. Or if we fail on disarmament, we must be prepared for a proliferation cascade and ultimately nuclear weapons use again, someday, somewhere, by someone. This was expressed in the language of security by our own Canberra Commission in the 1990s. As long as any country has nuclear weapons, others will want them. As long as nuclear weapons exist, they will be used again someday, if not by design, then inadvertently, through accident, rogue launch, or system error. Any use of nuclear weapons could be catastrophic for the whole world. The Ban Treaty updated this to humanitarian, also 3 propositions. No country individually, nor the international system collectively, has the capacity to cope with the humanitarian impacts of a nuclear war. It is in the interest of the very survival of humanity that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. I put under any circumstances in color because that's the phrase that caused us the biggest problem as Australia. Because you have to be able to contemplate its use under some circumstances, otherwise deterrence is not possible. And then the third one, only guarantee of non-use is the total, irreversible, and verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons. In other words, the collective interest of the international community in disarmament overrides the individual interest of the possessor states in national security that puts the world's very survival at risk. So what the majority of the world is objecting to is that the very possibility of nuclear war in the future must be eliminated by delegitimizing and eliminating the possession of nuclear weapons and the doctrines of nuclear deterrence today. The collective moral revulsion of the international community is embedded in this treaty as a normative treaty. That is its primary intended impact. They're trying to shape or reshape the global normative context, the prevailing cluster of laws, international, humanitarian, human rights, norms, principles, practices, and discourse that shape how we think about and how we act in relation to nuclear weapons. So that, particularly as the number of ratifying countries crosses 100, there will be a deepening crisis of legitimacy. Having said that, let's remember there are certain norms that are shared between the NPT and the Ban Treaty. Non-proliferation, no testing, even non-use. All sides want to avoid having to use nuclear weapons, avoid a nuclear war. But where we part company is in the threat of use, and therefore in deterrence, and therefore also from the other side in the importance of near-term practical actions to launch disarmament. And there is also a worry about the softening normative boundary between conventional and nuclear weapons. In terms of the problem, the NPT itself, and much more forcefully and strongly the Ban Treaty, identifies the bomb itself as a problem. But for many countries, including the United States, including us, in de facto terms, the problem is not the bomb, but who has them. And that's the instrumentalized reinterpretation of the NPT. There should be only one Article 6 there, not 6.6. Calls for each of the parties to the treaty to undertake effective measures at an early date for nuclear arms control and disarmament. This was strengthened by the World Court's advisory opinion in 1996 with three relevant important points: that any use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to international law, in particular humanitarian law; that they could not pronounce definitively that the use of nuclear weapons would be legal, even if the very survival of the state was under threat; and that states, because of that early date promise, had the obligation not just to pursue, but to bring to a conclusion efforts at nuclear disarmament. The problem with deterrence, there are several, and I'll just speed through them so I can finish on time. Firstly, the historical record is actually very ambiguous on the utility of deterrence. The peace in Europe, was it nuclear weapons? Was it the democratization of Western Europe? Was it the integration of Europe? But certainly there's no evidence that any side contemplated the act of aggression but was deterred from doing so by the knowledge that the other side had nuclear weapons. Not in Europe, nor anywhere else. And we do have contrary examples. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. No one doubted that the UK had nuclear weapons. United States, Soviet Union as it was, have suffered defeats on the battlefield and accepted defeat on the battlefield rather than escalate to nuclear weapons. There's marginal and questionable gains. It has limited utility. It's not that it doesn't have any utility, but again, in the context of the modern world and the threats we face, they are marginal and questionable. But the risks and threats and dangers are actually much more substantial. And that, of course, is the changing balance argument that Kissinger and Schultz and Perry and Nunn used to call for efforts to abolish nuclear weapons after the end of the Cold War. But of course, if you accept that deterrence works, then it's an equally dangerous proposition. If we really believe that deterrence is important and useful and works, why are we not encouraging Iran to get nuclear weapons so that we will have peace in the Middle East? Why should only one country have it if deterrence works and underpins stability? Why did we censor and sanction Pakistan and India? The more violent and conflict-prone a region, the more we should be facilitating and calling for countries in the region to get the bomb, so that then we can have guaranteed peace. Now, Bilahari is one of the few people who accepts the logic of that. But most of us are horrified at the thought, and I think with good reason. Because the mathematical probability of an unintended nuclear war grows exponentially with each additional entrant into the exclusive nuclear club. And that's why we try to do it. So, conclusions. The collective revulsion against the bomb of the international community found a double expression originally in the NPT, in both non-proliferation and disarmament obligations, and now in the Ban Treaty, which focuses just on the disarmament side. It reaffirms non-proliferation, but it extends to that. As I said earlier, the temporary exemption for the nuclear weapon states was implied a conditional acceptance of deterrence. But with the changing perceptions of risks, we now want to re-emphasize and elevate disarmament over deterrence because it is held to be unacceptable. And therefore, deterrence itself becomes a problem and disarmament is a solution. I think the Ban Treaty proponents accept that they can't get rid of nuclear weapons because they don't have them. But they point out, by the way, not a single warhead has been eliminated under the NPT either to date. Only the possessor states can cap, then reduce, and in the longer term eliminate under a verifiable, enforceable nuclear weapons convention after all the technical requirements for verification have been sorted out. But what the non-possessor states can do, and what they have tried to do through the Ban Treaty, is to stigmatize, to take away the legitimizing prop, to delegitimize the possession of nuclear weapons and the accompanying doctrines of deterrence based on the threat of use. The Nuclear Posture Review, and I'll finish with that, makes only one reference to the Ban Treaty, and that is to say that it injects disarmament into a non-proliferation fora regime. In other words, the Nuclear Posture Review of the United States, issued last month, pretends that Article 6 of the NPT doesn't exist. But to the majority of the world states, and all 122 states that voted for the Ban Treaty are members in good standing of the NPT, to the majority of them, the Ban Treaty represents completion of the NPT agenda. That tension between the two is going to be the most important issue on nuclear policy over the next 2 to 3 years. The two treaties have somehow to be harmonized, otherwise that disruption is going to magnify and amplify. Thank you very much.